to the show. This is a special edition of the Takedown with Nick, and we're going to have Leopold with us. We're going to be speaking about the issue of inequality and why it's important to people who may not understand or may not think that is important to them and how it relates. We have Leopold with us. He's a prolific writer. He's done quite a bit of things. I've read at least 2 or 3 of his books, but the one that we'll be talking about today will be the book Runaway Inequality. Let's have Les introduce himself. Hello, Les. How are you doing?
Fine, Nick. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful for you to take this time to come and spend with us and speak to us about this issue. This is an issue that's really, critical that we really have a discussion about this issue and kind of flesh out, some of the things that have been going on. So what I want to start off with is just what made you make this realization, or what made you connect the dots, so to speak, in your politics that brought you to the point where you are today?
Well, I've been doing a lot of writing about Wall Street, and I've been focusing on, the perils of Wall Street for the economy and how they're ripping us off and this and that. And then what got me going was my son was doing an internship with Fight for $15 an hour wage campaign in New York. And he comes home and he says, he's walking around New York and there are all these people sleeping on the street. And he goes, what's going on here? How can the richest country on earth not have the ability to feed and clothe its own people? He was just like stunned by this. So I started thinking about it and I thought, well, I was looking for something to write about. And I started thinking about maybe I'll write about homelessness. But when I looked at it more deeply, I realized that everything was connected through runaway inequality. I realized that inequality had been getting worse and worse and worse, and that virtually every issue that I cared about, and I thought most people cared about, was connected through runaway inequality. That it wasn't just a single issue. It wasn't just a issue amongst other issues. It was the issue that tied everything together. So that led me to start researching the book about 2 years ago. And I started testing out chapters on Alternate and Huffington Post just to see what kind of response I got. I got a really good response. I was surprised. So I put a draft together. And this is all before Bernie Sanders. Had no connection whatsoever with Bernie Sanders. Had no idea he was going to run. He doesn't know who I am. Well, maybe he does now, but he wasn't consulting with me or anything like that on issues.
Mm-hmm.
So about a year ago, spring, I was asked by the Communication Workers of America to run 5 half-day workshops for some of their key activists, Verizon workers, who were in their political action committees, just rank and file people. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to do it, but can I use this book as a text? And they said, sure. I said, it's only in draft form. And so we passed it out. And by the end of the class, we asked people, we went around the room and said, well, how many copies of this book would you like for your local and this kind of stuff? Figuring, well, maybe we can eventually get them 20, 30 books or something like that. And they came back and they said 3,100. It added up to 3,100 books. They were so excited. So that told me not that the book was so great, but it told me that the issue was right on the money. Then some people who had come to visit that class were from Citizen Action New York. They had a big conference and they wanted to reprint in draft form with all the proofreading mistakes and everything else. They wanted 600 copies. Next thing I knew, the CWA, Communication Workers, put up $1 million to train. They bought 14,000 copies of the book. They trained, we're in the process of training 80 of their people to be trainers. And they're taking 1,000 people out of work for a whole day, paying them to run through a class on runaway inequality. Meanwhile, the Sanders campaign takes off. And runaway inequality is the central theme of the Sanders campaign. And he virtually, I joke about this, that it's like he stole all the proposals at the back of the book. He field tested them. He came up with them on his own, I'm sure. But he went and tested all the tax on Wall Street, to pay for free higher education. That's one of the proposals in the book. Try, how do you deal with runaway inequality? You have to move money from where it is, which is from Wall Street, back into Main Street. So he then, not only did he take the proposals, but he showed that they had tremendous resonance with people all across the country. So meanwhile, we moved 30,000 copies of the book, and we're spreading the trainer program to New Jersey, Washington State, various other places, and having trouble keeping up with it. So it's been very fulfilling. None of the money goes to me personally. It goes back to the Labor Institute where I work, and it goes into basically a fund there to support more education and more development. So, for example, we're going to be printing 5,000 copies of the Spanish version of the book. So it's being translated to Spanish right now so that immigrant groups can use it. But the key thing is, one of the key concepts is, as we were talking before, is not only is the problem enormous, we have to understand what the book's about is how we got there. We're not going to have time on this interview to take people through that story. I do these 1 to 2 hour workshops all over the country doing that. And I'd love to do that online sometime, but the key is how do we overcome this? And that kind of takes us into the heart of the primaries, elections, and the election year, but also beyond, which is basically over the last 40 years, runaway inequality took hold in the economy, and it's become increasingly severe. So, for example, all the new economic growth that's taken place since 2008, there's been a recovery since the Great Crash. All the new growth, 95% of that income has gone to the top 1%. So even when the economy is recovering, it's not going to everybody else. And this isn't just a white working class issue. The people who are being screwed the most are the people at the bottom of the income ladder, regardless of race, color, or creed. They're the ones that suffer the most from runaway inequality.
Let me ask you a question though. Like when you were going through that there, you pointed out something that we have indeed had a recovery, and all the income has not really reached, the average individual. Most people, are slightly worse off or about where they were when the crisis hit. And I think it's important that we understand that there's an institutionalized aspect that creates that. And I think, I know, like you said, we don't have time to go through all of it, but I really want to pinpoint, if you could really, let's pinpoint like a broad brush on a couple of things at least.
Sure.
Get a broad brush.
Yeah, let me lay out the outline for you. That's a very good question, and I didn't mean to brush it aside, but we really should start there. What happened about 40 years ago, a new economic philosophy took hold within both political parties. The academics call it neoliberalism. We call it the better business climate model. And it still holds sway today. And the theory was you should get the government out of the economy. You should cut taxes so people have more of their own money to spend and invest. You should cut regulations, get the government out of the economy, and you should cut social programs so that the government doesn't give out handouts. And that's supposed to lead to a giant investment and profit pool, and then all boats would rise. There'd be jobs and higher incomes for everybody. That didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is that the deregulation of telephones and trucking and airlines is not the same as the deregulation of finance. The people at the time who peddled this didn't even know. I was in graduate school then, and they never talked about finance. Nobody talked about finance. But the Wall Street people were very shrewd when they saw this deregulate up until from 1933 to 1980. There was no premium for working on Wall Street. If you worked on Wall Street or you worked in General Motors, depending on your skill and experience, you got paid about the same. Then after deregulation hit, there was an enormous premium for working on Wall Street. So why was that? The answer is that in the deregulated environment, Wall Street figured out a way to basically financially strip mine corporation after corporation. They bought them up. They loaded them up with debt. They took out special dividends for themselves. they put in CEOs and changed the way they were paid. So all that CEOs cared about was the price of the stock. And then the most amazing thing of all happened. There was a rule change under the Reagan administration. Previously to that point, corporations were not permitted to buy lots of their own stock back because that was considered stock manipulation if they went to the market and bought back stock. After 1982, it was permitted. By 2008, now think about this for a second, this is mind-blowing, 75% of all corporate profits were used to buy back the shares of their own stock. Why? Because by doing so, they could increase the price of the shares. This Wall Street investors and the CEOs would make a killing by doing that. So the purpose of every corporation all across the country, this is what got institutionalized. The purpose of those corporations was not to produce a product, but was to produce cash flow to boost the price, to buy back their own shares, to boost the price of their own stock and to make a killing. So the ratio of income between the CEO and the average worker went from 45 to 1 in 1970 to a phenomenal 844 to 1 in 2014. Now think about this for a second. 45 to 1 means one car for you, for the average worker, 45 for the average top 100 CEO.
Let me.
One home versus 45 homes. Can you imagine one home versus 844 homes? That's how runaway inequality went berserk, and it's now built into the way our entire economy operates.
I was going to say, now remember, everyone. I want everybody to realize that when large sums of the corporate cash flow is used on these buybacks, that's, workers that aren't hired. That's investment into the company that's not done. That's higher prices for goods and services. So you have to remember that extracts a huge cost on everyone. And you just said that our whole economy is structured that way, which means that the pricing structure for goods and services, what people are paid, all those things will kind of shape around this gross manipulation of the corporate system.
It gets worse now. Not only does it impact workers inside facilities, so just what you said, this is the reason why they push jobs overseas and cut back wages and pensions and benefits and basically financially strip mine the company to get the cash flow to do the stock buybacks. That's the first part. The second part is basically the answer to my son's question, which is, how can the richest country in the world have a perpetual fiscal crisis? Our infrastructure is collapsing. How can that be? Well, the answer is, when you load up these companies with debt, that was a new thing. What the new thing in the deregulated environment was to buy up companies and then using a lot of debt, and then you put the debt on the company. It would be as if you went out and bought a car, and then the car had to pay back the loan and not you. That's the great thing for Wall Street people about corporate takeovers, is the company pays back the loans. Well, they did this tens of thousands of times all across the country. Virtually no company has been immune to this. And so corporate debt has grown and grown and grown. And like mortgages, the interest on corporate debt is tax deductible. So the corporate contribution to state and local taxes, for example, has fallen in half. So corporate money's not there. Okay, how about wealthy people? Well, as the rich get richer and richer, they don't want to pay taxes. They move their money offshore to the tune of something like $21 trillion. So they're not paying taxes. We're losing about $150 billion a year in corporate money, and in wealthy people's money that's parked offshore. So the rich aren't paying, the corporations aren't paying, and that leaves people in the middle and the bottom. We now, who are doing all the paying, we now have a perfectly regressive tax system on the state and local level. The rich pay half as much as a percent of their income as the bottom 20%. And it just gradually falls down the ladder. The poorer you are, the more you pay. So nobody has the money to pay more taxes. So you pit people against each other, private sector workers against public sector workers. Meanwhile, the rich are getting richer. Corporations are buying back their shares to enrich their CEOs and Wall Street investors, and an enormous amount of money. At one point, like in 2006, I think it was, 40% of all corporate profits ended up on Wall Street. So the money's been actually siphoned away from the rest of us. Now, the consequences this is where it gets depressing. I warn people when they're in my classes. I said, well, I'm going to have to take you way down before I can bring you back up. And I offer to share my Prozac with them if they're having any difficulties, because when this system has a tremendously negative impact on the unemployed and the poor. So in the 60s, when I came of age, government believed that it had the duty to try to eradicate poverty. This is before neoliberalism, better business climate model hit. So, there was an enormous number of experiments in the 60s to try to eradicate poverty, both in inner city, but also in Appalachia, white and black. And Head Start, for example, grew up. The war on poverty. Some of the programs worked, some of them didn't work, but there was a constant experimentation. This went on all the way even through the 70s. Like in 1979, when unemployment ticked up, Jimmy Carter created 10,000 new public sector jobs called CETA. Now, think about it for a second. When was the last time you heard a politician say, we're going to create more public sector jobs? We're going to have more teachers, more social workers, more firemen, more people to patrol our neighborhoods, community police. When was the last time you heard anybody argue for that? No, we have to privatize everything now. Well, so what happened to the people at the bottom of the income ladder? Well, here's the astonishing thing. If we could do a build chart on this show, I would show you that from 1910 to 1980, the prison population in this country held steady, right even through the big bad 1960s with sex, drugs, and rock and roll and riots. Still, the prison population was steady. Starting in 1980, when this better business climate model came in, where we basically gave up, abandoned lower income people, no jobs, you're on your own, fight for it yourself. The prison population shot up so dramatically that we now have over 2.2 million prisoners. We have more prisoners than any country in the world, both in absolute number and in percentage, more than China, Russia, North Korea, Cuba, name whoever bad actor that you think is out there. We have the most prisoners. We also gave up on the idea. So the other piece of this puzzle, and this is what became so powerful in the campaign, both these things did, was that we gave up on free higher education. In the 1960s, California was free. The whole system was free. New York, the whole system was free. And just about everywhere else, if you went to a state school and you had a decent summer job, you could afford to get your way through. Maybe have a little part-time gig while you're in school. It wasn't hard to afford college. Today, again, if you look at the chart, the same thing happens from 1980. Student loans just shoot through the roof. Today, it's a $1.2 trillion industry. So there was tremendous resonance for Sanders' proposal to have free higher education because it's so desperately needed. So no education, nothing for poor people, put them in prison. That becomes so we end up with a new philosophy. Basically, you're on your own. If you're unemployed, you're on your own. If you're a low-income person, you're on your own. Government, expect nothing from government. So that's kind of become our new ethos. So runaway. I can show you a chart of Ferguson. Michael Brown, who got killed in Ferguson, Missouri. If we look at what happened in Ferguson, how they collect money, you'll see the same pattern. For years, they collected about 7 or 8% of their income, local Ferguson income, through fines and forfeitures. Arresting people and not arrest, but mostly from tickets, driving tickets, and back payments on not paying your child support, that kind of stuff. Well, after the crash in 2007, 2008, they decided they had to ramp up how they got income. They couldn't get it from rich people who weren't around, or weren't paying. They weren't going to get it from corporations. So they decided to get it from their own low-income people. They doubled. The percent went up to almost 14% of their local revenues that came from fines and forfeitures. So they were looking for people to arrest. That's how Michael Brown fell into the net. They were literally looking to raise revenue by arresting people. And this, the Justice Department has a report that says this happened in 21 counties around St. Louis. And you can be sure this is happening in thousands of counties across the state. No wonder we have lower income people being victimized by the cops. No wonder we have Black Lives Matter. So there, these things just don't. This isn't just like racism. This is actually, it's deeper than that. This is the way we operate as an economy, and unless we change it, we're in trouble. So when
let me come in there for a second. Les. I want to remind everybody that we are broad brushing. We are broad brushing in this interview because, of course, this is a very, very deep topic, and we have Les Leopold with us, and he's the writer of Runaway Inequality. It's actually the book that really brought him to my attention. I've read some of his other books on financialization. However, this book here is something that we really, really want to talk about. And just from the last comments we were saying here, just to summarize, I want us to remember that in America, there is a huge amount of people that are relatively invisible. And a lot of times when we do things that are bad policy, or we implement things that are not necessarily best for all of us, the people at the bottom are going to feel the brunt of those decisions, and they're going to feel it first. But since they're ignored, nobody really fully understands the ramifications of bad policy until it starts creeping up. But even in economics, your leverage only exists so long as the person. I mean, really, it's related to the person below you, and so on and so on. So as their situation becomes more precarious, so will our situations a little bit higher and a little bit higher, and then eventually we'll reach the top echelon at some point. But I just want to kind of bring that to light, and then we'll go back into the conversation.
Okay. Anyway, so the 8-hour workshop that these workers do and the 1-hour version I do kind of runs through, maybe 20, 30, 40 charts from the book that show how all these things are connected. But there are two takeaways that all this leaves me with, and I hope everybody else with. Hope they see it as well. Two takeaways. The first one is, this is important, runaway inequality will not cure itself. There is no magic pendulum in the economy that swings back and forth between more or less inequality.
Can I ask a question right there when you say
sure.
that?
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who believe that, you can just make incremental changes, here and there, and they point to the New Deal as their model for saying, change takes time, but we've done it before, we can do it. All we have to do is just do, one small thing at a time. But I've never witnessed a systemic issue that's changed, incrementally, like by piecemeal, trying to poke around the edges. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. I think that the parts of the New Deal that were not incremental were the parts that made a big difference. The wage and hour laws, the Wagner Act for labor, Social Security, welfare, and most importantly, the incredibly severe controls on Wall Street. We put our foot on the neck of Wall Street for 25, 30 years, and it was really good for the economy. Once we took our foot off, they just turned around and bit it off. But anyway, the point I want to make is too often the press talk and politicians talk about the economy as if it was some sort of machine, that has kind of this life of its own, and it's just going to fix itself. The free market will just fix itself. If we only get out of the way, things will get better. That's just not going to happen. We have no evidence that can happen. We have all the evidence to show that it's going to continue to get worse. That 844 to 1 is going to be 1444 to 1 in a few years. It's just going to get worse, and we're going to feel more and more impoverished. They're going to be living a life that we can't possibly imagine, and we're going to be feeling pressed, depressed, anxious, insecure, and chewing on each other's legs. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is it's going to take nothing short of a mass movement to change this. This isn't just a question of policy. It's a question of organizing ourselves to really press for significant change. And the last time we did this was in the 1880s. Last time we took on Wall Street with a mass movement was in the 1880s when the populists and this was small farmers, black and white, mostly in the South and the Midwest, were absolutely going crazy over the squeeze Wall Street had over the money supply. You couldn't get any loans without going to Wall Street. The government was totally out of it, and Wall Street dominated all the loan and price policies that dealt with farmers, and they were going bankrupt right and left and right and left. So this populist movement began, and they went out. They sent 6,000 educators into the field to talk to people about why they needed cooperatives, why that we needed a federal income tax, why we needed public banks, and so on. And they wanted public ownership of railroads, telegraph, telephone. Anyway, they had a big assault, and they had an enormous impact. Virtually the entire New Deal grew out of the ideas put forth by the populists. We got a public bank. That the best alternative to Wall Street is to create public banks. We have one in North Dakota, which is the most profitable bank in the whole country, and its top CEO, instead of making $30 million like he would on Wall Street, makes $250,000. Entry-level worker makes $35,000, and a ratio of 7-to-1, not 844 to 1. So there's this. They had this incredible influence. By the way, we got a constitutional amendment because of the populists to have allow a progressive income tax. So what do we learn from the populists? We learn that we need just what you said, we need a big, broad, powerful, universal program that we advocate for. And the Sanders campaign, I think people don't sometimes realize how incredibly amazing it is that campaign took off and came so close to success, because he was advocating proposals that he would have been run out of town for years before: free higher education, single payer health care, a financial speculation tax on Wall Street, which is absolutely critical. He was calling it like it is. Now, I think he got but he was up against a headwind of what I would call movement silos, because our accommodation to the better, we as progressives accommodated ourselves over the last 40 years to this better business climate era, the neoliberal era. And we fractured ourselves into a series of individual issues, all the identity issues, the environment, and labor issues, and various war and peace issues. They all became separate issues. We created silos. We went out and raised money for those silos. We competed with each other to get those funds, and we developed identities. And those identities became very powerful. So environmentalists say, I'm an environmentalist. Labor people say, I'm labor. Black Lives Matter say, I'm black. I'm a black activist, and so on. And immigration activists, same kind of thing. And what the Sanders campaign showed was the power of coming together around some incredibly important themes that would benefit everybody. As you mentioned so rightfully, the people on the bottom are the biggest beneficiaries from these universal programs. A program for free higher education, single payer health care, and a jobs program that deals with youth unemployment. It's going to be the people on the bottom, who are disproportionately people of color, who are going to benefit the most. And to have everybody support those programs is the only way they could get passed. So breaking out of our silos, one of the communication Verizon workers came up with this phrase. He says, I get it. We need to become silo busters. He said that at a workshop at the Citizen Action Conference, and he got a standing ovation because people were ready to come out of their silos. They're ready to come together to attack runaway inequality in all its manifestations, and they want a movement. They want a mass movement, which is the only way we can tackle runaway inequality. So I put it
Let me ask two questions right there in that train of thought.
Sure.
I mean, you're using the Sanders campaign as an example, but, many times the critics of the Sanders campaign felt that, the separate issues that were universal don't really actually apply to them based off of their identity. And I want to hear what you have to say about that. Then I have another question.
Well, look, I did some research on Who has the most student loans? It's people of color. So free higher education is going to benefit people of color. Who gets the worst health care? People at the bottom of the income ladder. So a universal healthcare system that gets the insurance companies out of it is going to create a better healthcare system. Who's going to benefit? It's going to be people on the bottom. Who's going to benefit the most for youth unemployment? Well, youth unemployment is highest amongst African Americans. Then comes Latinos, but there's 33% of white youth are also suffering from unemployment and underemployment. So I have trouble understanding how. I mean, runaway inequality means people on the bottom are being screwed. So if we can do something about runaway inequality, by definition, it helps people on the bottom who are disproportionately people of color. How about the prison population? It's still majority white, but if we do something about the prison population, we're going to help. We should cut the prison population at least by half, and that's going to help people of color. Anything we can do to end the fiscal crisis. I mean, look at our inner city infrastructure. If we could take money from Wall Street and rebuild the infrastructure, it would make an enormous difference to the people of cities that have suffered disinvestment for the last 40 years, who've been strip mined through privatization and having their companies basically wiped out. It's hard for me to understand how attacking runaway inequality doesn't disproportionately help people at the bottom. Now, I think what's happened is there are a lot of people who have accommodated themselves to neoliberalism. And they think that what they're concerned about is we need to have a better distribution of hedge fund people who are Black and women and Latino, et cetera. I'm sorry, I don't care about that. It may be true that that's an all-white group, but you know what? They're the people I'm fighting. They're the enemy. Whether they integrate or not is of no concern to people at the bottom of the income ladder. So I think we have to be careful. It's easy for neoliberals. It's easy for them to accommodate. Even Donald Trump could accommodate some of the demands coming around identity politics. He can appoint people who are people of color. He'll appoint, various right-wing conservative African Americans to be, heads of secretaries of different departments. He could do that. Big deal. What really matters is fighting runaway inequality. We can build a movement of Black and white, Latino, immigrant, and Native Americans. We can all come together, as started to happen in the Sanders campaign. I had access, by the way, to polling data from the Sanders campaign, and people under 30, vast majorities of every color group was for Sanders. The older color groups were for Clinton. The younger ones, all for Sanders.
Now, let me make an aside to that. Sure. I mean, even though that polling data may, it is what it is. That's definitely true. We have to remember that, all of us are operating within a system, right? So even though you may feel that way now at someone who's under 30, they have 20 to 30 years to really work you with propaganda to kind of bring you away from that. So that may not necessarily, what I want to get away from is assuming that just because they agree with it and they want to push for it doesn't mean they can't be misdirected into things that are non-productive. Because just as you said that, there's polling data out showing that a large number of millennials are also favoring libertarianism. I'm going to definitely be talking about a little bit of that, but just to see that some people are falling for libertarianism as an answer, as opposed to really a broad retaking of the government or retooling of how we do policy, or a reshaping of the institutions that are governed by policy, and that's concerning.
Well said. That takes me into my last point, which is this: all that will happen. We will lose. Basically, you're describing a path for how we can lose. The way we win is to build a real organization. That organization mirrors what the populace did. I want to be able to go to Patterson or New Jersey or Pomona, California, or Pensacola, Florida, and walk into a meeting of, I don't care, call it the maybe call it our revolution. I don't care. I want to be able to walk in and join with my brothers and sisters to fight against runaway inequality on a state, local, and national level. I am certain that the American people are ready for this. I give this talk all over the country, and the only reason I do it is the response is overwhelming. Not because I'm a charismatic speaker. I'm not. It's because the time has come. Look, Bernie Sanders is no charismatic person. He's been saying the same stuff for 40 years. The world changed. It got worse, and his message rang true. But it can't just be around candidates. We need our own organization. We need to come together. I'm not saying that we abandon our identities, but we add another layer. We can stay as environmentalists or identity activists or whatever. That's fine. But we need another level where we all come together and say, yes, we are building a movement. It doesn't erase all the problems. It's not going to eliminate racism, which is so deeply embedded in the country. It's not going to eliminate so many festering issues. But it gives us a chance to fight back and reclaim these institutions, just as you described. Otherwise, also as you just described, the propaganda will set in, people will drift towards libertarianism, or they'll, become bought into the, misunderstanding of what's going on, and we'll lose. We need our own movement organization. We had them in the 60s for a while. We can do it again. And the Sanders campaign proves to me at least, that the audience, imagine if half the money that Sanders got at $27, imagine if $13 went to fund a movement so that people didn't have to raise money from foundations. We raise it from our own people. Imagine how powerful. We'd be the largest, most powerful institution in the country, political institution. So it can be done. I think people are hungry to do it. It's forming the organization is over my pay grade, but I'm building the educational infrastructure. We're training trainers. Book is spreading, and there are people. Every time I do one of these talks, I ask how many people here would like to be trained to be a runaway inequality trainer or reversing runaway inequality trainer, and about 95% of people raise their hands. I can't accommodate them all now, but we're moving towards that. So I'm working on the educational infrastructure. So I tell people, let me sort of close with this, if I could. I tell people there are 4 things we need to have a chance at reversing runaway inequality. One is we need a common analysis and a common agenda. And I think we're very close to that. I think what's in the book and what Sanders put forth, we can argue about this and that proposal, but we're not that far apart on some universal, broad, big-time proposals to, reclaim the country. 1. 2, we need the educational infrastructure, and I think we know how to do that. And people are starting to pony up for funds to actually begin experimenting and trying to make that happen. We need the common organization, which I said is over my pay grade, but there are people talking about it, trying to make it happen. I think our revolution got off to a rocky start, but who knows? There has to be a lot of trial and error before that thing clicks in. But finally, the most important thing, the hardest thing, the most complicated thing is in our heads. This is the point that I think you just made perfectly, which is we've been kind of colonized by runaway inequality, by the neoliberal better business climate model. We think it's natural. We think this is the natural order of things and that it can't be changed. And if we think it can't be changed, we won't try to change it. We are stuck in the silos and we think it can't be changed. So breaking out of the silos to become silo busters, believing that we can make the change, having the attitudinal change in ourselves, that's the hardest thing. And that's the thing I think you're working on every time you do one of these shows. And thank you so much for doing that. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what we all have to try to do if we're going to, have a chance of success.
Let me ask you one last question before you close.
Go ahead. Sure.
Moving back, you mentioned the populists and the movement that was there. A lot of these movements that kind of led to the progressive era and then later on kind of rose again and culminated in the New Deal. A lot of them were driven first by, of course, the grassroots, but the unions really being like the glue to kind of get the organizing and get the foot soldiers on the ground and get the information out to everyone. How can we kind of mimic that without those institutions there? Like, remember the institutions that existed at that time, they've all been ravaged one by one in order to get them back to where they are today, in order to get us back to where we are today.
Well, it's interesting that very, very interesting point that you're raising. Actually, the percent of the population that's unionized in the 1880s and in the progressive era, at the turn of the century up until the New Deal, it's about the same as now. The big rise took place from 1933 to 1970, roughly. That's when the big explosion took place, especially in the 30s and 40s. But you're right to say that the unions were very active and involved, because the few unions that were around were very good, right? And they made a big difference.
Incredibly.
There's still a few unions around that are very good and make a big difference. Any union that survives now has got to be, is got something together. But there's a few of them who stand out, like the Communication Workers of America, the Service Employees Workers, the National Nurses United, the Amalgamated Transit Union, the Postal Workers Union, the Steel Workers. These are unions that actually care about movement building more or less. Several of them were key in the Sanders campaign, poured an enormous amount of resources in it. And so they can still form the core of exactly what you're describing. So we don't have to do it alone. The former head of the Communication Workers of America, Larry Cohn, is the political director of Our Revolution. And he was the key labor person for Sanders and brought some of the other unions in. So there's some very, very good labor people who are still involved, who, if you had them on this show, they'd be right on your wavelength. You'd have a fantastic interview. I can recommend Larry Cohn would be one. Roseanne DeMoro from the National Nurses United California. She'd be fantastic. Bob Master from CWA. You would have in New York, who was also co-chair of the Working Families Party. These people are movement builders. But success is not guaranteed. But the good news is we saw the beginnings of this with Occupy Wall Street. That was the first shot across the bow. Unfortunately, it was disorganized and it fell apart. I think
it was destroyed by the police, not just fell apart. It didn't collapse on its own.
More than that. It was more than that. I'm telling you, they couldn't make decisions. They couldn't have any leaders. They had no plan for the winter. They had all the money you can imagine. People were throwing money at them, but they believed in horizontal organizing, and there's another whole interview about organizing stuff. Then we have Black Lives Matter, which obviously has become a very potent force, and then the Sanders campaign. So you can see that these broad-based national efforts are possible. There were 900 encampments of Occupy Wall Street. That was phenomenal. They're the reason we're talking about runaway inequality in Wall Street. They put it on the map. I don't know if people remember, but the summer before was the summer of the so-called grand bargain between the Obama administration, the Democrats, and the Republicans to cut Social Security and tighten our belts. And then the conversation switched just because of Occupy Wall Street. So there's power to be had. We have to organize it. We have to harness it. And I'm hoping that young folks like you will be able to really fan the flames, and we can get another generation of people who really, really want to build a movement organization. That's the direction we have to head into.
I agree with you, especially everything you just said. It's just I still feel like outside of the movements are coming. There seems to be, especially with some of the names you named there seems to be a lack of militancy. Like there was a determination that existed that you can read about when you read some of the activists in their writings, and you hear about some of the people that were orators of the time. There was a tenacity and a militancy that I think that is still not quite there. I don't see anybody saying, this is the way it's going to be. This is what we want. I still feel like maybe there's just maybe it's not quite there yet. It's building. Maybe it'll come, maybe it won't. I'm not sure.
I'm very impressed with the way you're analyzing the situation, because you're sort of expressing a lot of my inner fears and thoughts. Uh, I noticed the same thing that you just talked about, and I was advocating. I said, look, day after the inauguration, we got to bring 1 million people to Washington. Got to shut the place down and demand the financial transaction tax for free higher education. Get kids and their parents from all over the country and shut down DC. Bring 1 million people in. That'll show Congress that we mean business. But they're afraid to do it. They're afraid, oh, what if we only get 100,000? It won't be good. So there's this timidity. Remember, see what you're talking about, what I'm talking about is the same thing. The headset hasn't gotten there yet. We're still trapped in, oh, maybe we can accommodate ourselves within, the current power arrangements. We can't. They're going to crush us. We're going to have to build something new. So I think two things have to happen: that assertiveness that you're talking about, combined with organization. It's spontaneous revolt. It's not going to work. It's wonderful to see, but we have to actually build something that could sustain a struggle for 10 or 20 years. It took a long time to get us into this mess. It's going to take us a long time to get us out.
I 100% agree with you. And I just want to add one thing to that. We have to understand also that it could be 10 or 20 years from the moment we start having the tenacity. So, the movement building is forming. It still didn't have its tenacity, still didn't have critical mass. But once we have it, it has to be sustained.
Amen.
Sustained for years. Amen. Because they're not going to roll over and give us anything. Neoliberalism, amen. I say it 1,000,000 times, it's not going to go quietly into the night. It's not going to pack up its bags and go home. We're going to have to beat it back, and we're going to have to hold it back, for the next generation and beyond. So that's just what it is. I'm going to give you the last word, Les, and then we're going to close out for the viewers. Maybe I'll answer a few questions and hang around for them, but I don't want to, basically monopolize your time. I've taken quite a bit of it as is.
My last word is everybody should be listening to you. I agree with everything you just said, and that's exactly right. Build for the long term. Everyone should be listening to you. Keep saying it. That's my last word. Keep saying what you're saying.
Thank you, Les. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And again, remember, his book is Runaway Inequality, an Activist Guide to Economic Justice. And, Les, you're free to stay or leave whenever you like. I'm going to go ahead and just go to our channel here and see if any of the viewers have anything pertinent, like any questions or whatnot I can answer while I still have 5 or so minutes. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that hadn't been on my mind.
Good night, everybody. Good night. Thank you so much.
Okay. That was a very, very interesting interview. I've never, it's hard for me to do these interviews, and I try to guide the conversation, but it's really, really easy when you have someone like Les come in and he sort of, gives voice to what you're feeling inside, or where your thoughts may already be. And, there's such a huge gap between he's a writer and he's written many books and has been working in the movement for such a long time. And here I am, a world away across the country, and we're just on the same wavelength as to where we are. But just to clarify, when I was talking about a militancy, I firmly believe in an argument that I had heard. I think Chris Hedges put this one out. It was truth and justice is not compatible with power and privilege. So what we have to understand is, while we're fighting this, if we're going to stand up on principle, oftentimes that is going to, kind of be 100% incompatible with power and privilege. So when you have people that are privileged or individuals that are inside of the power structure, a lot of times they're going to have to make a choice between doing what they feel is right and doing what's expedient to them or their class per se. And we have to always be mindful of that. And that's why when people make decisions that you don't like, you don't need to give them the benefit of the doubt. You need to evaluate what they're doing and evaluate what you think the consequences can or will be and make a judgment based off of that, not just who it is. And what I'm saying when I say this, I'm thinking of a particular instance. I'm thinking of when people were giving Sanders critique. A lot of people are saying, he's been around in politics for a long time. We have to just trust him. It's like, no, you don't trust anyone. In politics, we don't know these people on a personal level. We are having to judge them based off of their actions in the moment. And if we feel that they're not right, we have all the liberty in the world to critique and say whatever we want about what they're doing in the instant. Because the moment you feel like you have to not listen to your feelings, not listen to your gut instinct, and not judge what you see as happening and try to trust in someone else, we've already lost. We have to be able to hold them accountable, because that's the exact same thing we did with President Barack Obama. I'm just going to go ahead and end on that. And remember, everyone, truth and justice is not compatible with power and privilege. Thank you.